Schlote from Ontario, Canada, and she is from the Refuge, right? Center for Healing and Recovery. We're going to get your slides up, and we will...
Thanks so much, Steve, who's not Michael. Thank you. All right. Welcome, everybody. This topic is very near and dear to all of us, and I think hopefully we'll get it all done in these next 20 minutes. The slides also, if anyone is interested in receiving them, please come up and see me later with your business card or an email address. I'm more than happy to share a copy of this with everybody here. So, I was really inspired by this idea of One Health, which I've been aware of for some time. I was not aware of the equivalent, which is One Welfare, so I was very, very happy to hear about that. Because what we're going to talk about today is this idea of, if it's not good for the animals, how can it possibly be good for the humans as well in the interventions? Thank you. And this, actually, I was inspired by this topic way, way a long time ago. I'm more involved in horses, so this will focus more on horse-human interactions. But my introduction into the field of AAI was actually through a therapy dog program where I would volunteer with my dog in a local nursing home. And I started to realize, I love the idea, the idealism of it all, and the giving back to the community idea, and this belief in the power of animals and the human-animal bond. But I noticed that my dog, as much as she passed all the tests and she was certified, did not actually like the interactions. And I started to feel really unethical about bringing her and making her have to go through these interactions with these residents who absolutely loved her and they couldn't tell the difference. But I was starting to notice, I don't think she's actually enjoying this. And I retired her from service. And that belief in understanding that the animals also have an experience in this process and that it's a relationship, it's not just this thing needs getting met at the expense of, really started to drive my own perspective about the work. And so this idea of One Health, although it's really focused mainly, as we heard about on day one, about this idea of zoonotic disease, I think really was what it was originally about, and injury and so on. We all know that there's also emotional, relational, behavioral implications to this beyond just medical. And so we need to really apply a trauma lens to the human-animal relationship, in particular in animal-assisted interventions. Briefly, I'm going to talk a little bit about the similarities that we all have as mammals, because it's really interesting and important to recognize that for as much as we have differences that are species-based, we also share a lot of things in common. And so that is just a foundation that I like to come from. So Bradshaw and his colleagues said that neuroscience has demonstrated that all mammals share a ubiquitous developmental attachment mechanism and a common stress-regulating neurophysiology. So in short, we're all driven to bond and relationship, and we all have a nervous system that regulates arousal, in short. So we all have that, right? Regardless of what species we're from, right? We connect in relationship. We're born in the womb of somebody else, right? We self-soothe, we co-regulate with one another, we bond, we learn about social norms, we learn about where you end and I begin. All that happens regardless of species. And humans and other mammals, we have these really strong attachment needs. So this comes out of Bowlby and Ainsworth's work, the idea of safe haven and secure base, right? When our needs are getting met and we're attuned to and we experience responsiveness, we're more likely to return to our primary caregiver when we're feeling distressed or scared. That's the secure base phenomenon, and horses do that as well. That's not just unique to humans. There's a really cute video. I have a YouTube channel where I have a number of different videos saved, and one of them is a foal playing with a Shar-Pei, and then running back to his mom, and then coming back out to play with the Shar-Pei. So you can see that concept of the secure base occurs really across species. We tend to seek proximity to our caregivers, our protectors, our co-regulators, and experience separation distress when we're not able to do so. And we need safety to develop optimally, right? So this is coming out of the developmental neuroscience, Dr. Bruce Perry's work, right? If the input in our worlds is disorganized, right? If we are experiencing abuse, we experience neglect and sort of chaotic or confusing interactions, the brain will develop in a confusing, chaotic, disorganized kind of way. So if the input into our experience is organized, the output, the brain development will be organized, the nervous system will be organized, and that's what leads us to have better resilience. If we have disorganized input, our development is disorganized, which means we have less resilience. Pretty straightforward, but this is true for other animals as well. There's a lot of research on lab animals and being removed from their mothers at certain weeks of age, and then seeing increased addictions, increased tendency to have alcohol or use cocaine when cocaine is presented in the rat cage or the bird's cage or the primate's cage, right? And so when that maternal deprivation occurs, disorganized input, early separations, we see that kind of disorganized development, and it's true for humans as well. And Stephen Porges and other people talk a lot about this idea that there's a hierarchical responses to threat, right? We will use our social engagement system first in order to find resources, find protection, find comfort, or to fawn, appeasement behaviors to placate the source of the threat, followed by fleeing. If fleeing is not possible, we fight. If that's not possible, we go into a shutdown response. Right, so we have freeze, fold, which is the collapsed immobility response, faint, feigning death, and fragmentation or dissociation. So we have all these Fs that we do, and mammals all have these F responses as well. So this is just a little diagram. This is why I suggest if you really would like the slides, let me know, because it'll be easier to see this. But we'll start with that neuroception of safety. When we start to feel danger or life threat, we'll start to mount those self-protective responses. And when we're no longer able to do that, we go into a shutdown. And then when we thaw out of freeze, sometimes we're going to see a lot of that hyperarousal, those incomplete self-protective responses starting to complete. We'll see, you can think about it with horses, a horse that's shut down, learned helplessness, learned to be cooperative and submissive. You know, when they start to have an opinion, they start to feel safe, they get more agitated, they might get more, aroused, show more opinionatedness, they might show more aggression, right? Because they're waking up out of that freeze. So as you go in, so we come out. We all have this. This is not unusual. So this idea of trauma-informed care is it's not what's wrong with you, it's what's happened to you, right? And how have you coped to survive? So this is not necessarily new information for any of you, but if we're not applying that to the horse in the equation, or in other words, other animals that are involved in the interventions, we start to encounter other challenges, which I'll get to in a second. So humans and other mammals, including animals that are involved in animal-assisted interventions, are impacted in similar ways to trauma and chronic stress and other forms of adversity, right? So Dr. Peter Levine will talk about thwarted self-protective responses, what happens in the nervous system when we are not able to fight or flee effectively. So we might see increased aggression, acting out, shutdown responses, increased addictions and obsessive compulsive behaviors, otherwise known as stereotypies with non-human animals, increased fear and avoidance responses, insecure attachment patterns, health syndrome, so GI issues, ulcers, etc., right? We start to see a lot of health problems when there's all this unresolved self-protective energy in the body. And there can be an increased risk for traumatic reenactments, which is really the focus of my conversation today with all of you. Traumatic reenactments occur in lots of different subtle ways, and we don't always notice what they are until they've passed. So this is just a short list of what some of those can look like. These don't just occur between humans. These can and do occur in the context of animal-assisted interventions between the client and the animal, between the facilitator and the client, between the facilitator and the animal, between a co-facilitator and the co-facilitator. These kinds of reenactments can happen a lot if we're not paying attention. And so coercion, submission, appeasement, exploitation, overwhelm, overriding to get through something, misattuning, misreading, co-dysregulation, I'm getting activated along with your activation, and that's going to affect how we intervene. Feeling trapped, trauma bonding, right, where our trauma stuff starts to ping off of the other person or the other animal's trauma stuff, and then we see interactions that are just about repeating certain things. Gaslighting is a common one, right? Most of our trauma survivors are really familiar with that one, right? Where something happens, they react in response to what's happened, and then they're blamed for their reaction. Right? We do this with animals all the time too, right? We're not paying attention to our dysregulation, our habits, our patterns. The animal reacts and then we punish or blame the animal for their very reasonable reaction if you step back enough to look at why they reacted in the first place, right? So that's gaslighting. projection, right? Not seeing something in ourselves and interpreting it in the other, blaming the victim, which is part of gaslighting. Dynamics that support powerlessness and helplessness, dynamics that support getting stuck in fight, flight, or freeze, often where the facilitator can't recognize it. A colleague of mine talks about a situation where she was working with somebody in equine-assisted psychotherapy who attended an equine-assisted psychotherapy workshop, and the person, as a result of the facilitator's intervention, started to go into a dissociative response and hadn't been right since taking part in that activity or that workshop. And the person was stuck in that very strong freeze, disconnected kind of state, and the facilitators couldn't see it. And that happens for the horses as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that in some of my case examples. So hurt begets hurt, blindness begets more blindness, and it happens regularly. So a few examples, and then I'll talk about some cases. So not taking no for an answer or missing the subtle signs of no. If we do not recognize that an animal is communicating a no in the context of an animal-assisted intervention, regardless of species, what is that communicating to both the animal? How will that impact the human-animal relationship? How does that impact the client's perception of the interaction, the client's perception of the therapist or the facilitator, right? If a client has experienced coercion or their no was not recognized or acknowledged during their abuse, people are often really good at sniffing that out. Right? Something doesn't feel right here. And oftentimes, my clients will often tell me, when I used to bring my dog to the office, and I started to realize he didn't like being in my office all day, even though we would go out for walks, I started leaving him at home. And my clients were like, oh, we really miss Trigger. Where's Trigger? And I said, well, you know, Trigger has been communicating that he's not comfortable being in the office. He gets a little agitated. He loves people, loves it. He's great at it, but he can't do a full day. And unfortunately, I can't drive him home and then come back to work, so I leave him at home. And my clients are actually really relieved, right? They're like, wow. And they actually trust me a little bit more because they go, wow, you're paying attention to their needs. Maybe you'll pay attention to mine as well. Maybe I'm in a situation where someone can actually get it and see the thing that's happening, right? Especially for clients whose needs were not recognized. So let me come here for a second. So another one that happens often is that compliance, assuming that compliance equals choice or consent. That's a really big one, especially in the field of equine-assisted therapy. A common thing that we'll hear is, well, the horse is at liberty, and therefore the horse can choose to walk away if it wants to. If it's really uncomfortable, it can leave. And I go, how many rape survivors were told, why couldn't you just walk away, or why didn't you scream, or why didn't you move away from the thing if you were really that bothered by it? How many people have blamed the victim inadvertently, right? There's not an understanding of the neurobiology and how freeze responses can actually create an experience of compliance, an experience of submission. Submission looks like choice, but not really, right? There's a big difference. And if we start equating submission to choice, we're in a slippery slope. And again, what does that communicate to the client? Assuming that quiet means calm, right? Again, that's another great example. Not all quiet is created equal. Right? When you start to track the nervous system, some quiet states are actually immobility responses linked to learned helplessness, right? And so when we have those kinds of states happening and we misinterpret that as, oh, well, the horse is fine or the animal's fine, they're at liberty, they can move away, when you're not taking into consideration everything else that's going on. What's going on with the horse's body language? Is their face tuned out? Are their eyes even present? How's the bracing in the legs? Are the ears pinned back, right? If we're not paying attention to the full picture, we can easily misinterpret and create another reenactment, right? Which is not going to be helpful for the horse-human relationship. Getting needs met at the expense of another is that same thing. Unresolved trauma in the co-facilitation team, so that's one I've experienced personally. It's one of the reasons why I often will facilitate these things by myself. Because if you have unresolved issues with your co-facilitator, those show up in the sessions, which they can, that can be very problematic for clients. I had one client once where we were in an equine-assisted intervention, and my co-facilitator had a rather strong response and needed to be right and kept trying to prove herself right. And was putting me down in the process, and it was a very odd situation, and she was trying to put the client down, and it was really odd. And afterwards, the client told me, she said, Sarah, you know, it felt like my mom and dad were having an argument, right? And I was like, gosh, this is, and you know, when you're trying to monitor your own responses and you cannot in the moment, you know, pull the facilitator aside and say, hey, what's coming up for you and what's happening in your nervous system and, you know, is this your stuff? And when the containment isn't there, that can bleed out, right? And create some issues. And then, of course, doing things that are beyond the window of tolerance for both the horse or the human. If we're going too far beyond that person's tolerance, then we're shifting into overriding, which isn't really resilience. It's just muscling up and doing willpower to muscle through, right? We're wanting to hopefully develop capacity, not just teach people to tolerate stuff. I'm going to talk a little bit about this just briefly because I don't have a ton of time. This was originally sent as a proposal for a 1-hour presentation. I did not know it was going to be 20 minutes, so bear with me. So traumatic reenactments also can happen in terms of insecure attachment dynamics, right? People who have insecure attachment relationships with their pets tend to have more negative interpretations or expectations of the human-animal relationship, and that can lead to some challenges as well in terms of what we expect. I cite the research here in terms of this particular study looked at attachment styles and how that influenced people's selection of horse training methods and their perception of the horse, right? So people's attachment styles was able to predict whether or not they viewed the horse as being naughty and dominant and willful, or if they viewed the horse as having difficulty with the human's cues. Right? And so the perception of the horse depended on the attachment style, which creates another reenactment. If your attachment style leads you to believe that the horse is being disrespectful, maybe you were parented like that, our tendency is to pass that on. So these kinds of things happen all the time. I'm going to skip forward here because I want to talk a little bit about the importance of understanding the populations. So people who come to animal-assisted interventions are usually, you know, they're desperate for change, right? They might not know what therapeutic interventions are available. They might not have the funding for therapeutic interventions that might be helpful. They might not know that there's trauma treatment available that doesn't involve animals that could be perhaps cheaper to get into, right? They might not know, or there maybe is no one local that provides this. And they love animals, and animals may have been a resource in the past, so they're coming in with really high expectations and hope. And they may have difficulties with boundaries and trauma and dysregulation and reenactments. And the animals in these programs also often, but not always, have these backgrounds as well, right? So these are animals that have been, you know, in rescues. They've maybe gone from owner to owner. Some of them have had different training experiences, have been raised a particular way, and may have difficulty with boundaries and dysregulation and attachment as well. When that's not taken into consideration, some challenges can ensue. So we need to really monitor carefully. So one thing I always say is that healing with horses isn't healing if it comes at the expense of the horse. This is true for any animal in animal-assisted interventions. So let's talk a little bit more about some things. This was this idea of one health. If it's not good for one, it's probably not good for the other, which means we need, I'm going to skip through this because I don't know how much time I've got left, Steve. Okay, I'm going to skip through some of this. This is just this idea of renegotiation versus reenactment. Like I said, please come up to me afterwards and we'll talk a little bit about the slides and me getting those slides to you. I will say this, there's corrective emotional experiences that we're looking to have. It's not just for the human, but also for the animal, so the animal gets to benefit as well. Facilitators have to track a lot of different things in doing this work, right? So it's more than just seeing whether or not the human is having a good positive experience. It's no longer about the warm fuzzies. This isn't a petting zoo, right? We're looking for more than that. What is going on at the level of the relationship? So we're having to facilitate and track a lot of different things in the course of this work, which makes it very, very tricky and easy to miss things. So I'll pick a couple of the case examples that I have to cover. So the first one was an example that somebody shared with me. These are all examples that I'm modifying slightly, but that were shared from other situations. So participants go to a workshop, they do a meet the herd activity, they're told to go down the aisle of the barn, and they're gonna go into a stall with a horse and just spend some time quietly and notice what they notice and then journal about their experience. So they go into the stalls. As they go into the stalls, the facilitators come along behind them and lock the stall doors. I had that reaction too, which is why I'm bringing this one up. But they weren't told ahead of time that there would be locking of the stall doors. So one, there was no informed consent, right? Two, there's no opportunity for escaping. Three, a lot of these people are not horse people, so they don't know what to expect. Four, even the horse people were nervous, right? Five, they were no longer in the experience because their nervous system was in that neuroception of potential danger, and they were focused more on feeling trapped and unable to escape, as opposed to really getting benefit from the activity, right? Since then, that particular program now does not latch the doors. A facilitator stays nearby, doesn't walk away, and they sometimes will use one of those little chains instead, which creates much more maneuverability. But reenactment here is, I can't escape, I'm trapped, right? This is out of my control. I have to override and muscle through to get through. The horse might not be comfortable. Is the horse's boundaries and needs recognized? What if the horse is not comfortable? It can't move away, right? So there's all these reenactments that take place in something as simple as a meet the herd exercise. This is another one I call stand still and tolerate it. I could not find an image of a horse at liberty looking shut down in the midst of being touched, but this happens a lot. And one example is, there's actually a video I saw recently on YouTube, and it's, sadly, it's actually a newspaper reporting about an equine assisted therapy program, and you can see in the video a horse that really is, you look for the calming signals, right? So the facilitator is helping the client's wanting to touch the horse, and the horse flinches, and the horse looks away, and moves its weight over onto the side furthest away from the client. There's no interaction. There's no, hey, what are you noticing is happening for the horse? And you know, none of that. It's just, oh, where else might you touch the horse? And then the client moves around to the other side, and the horse tries to move away by stepping forward, and the horse professional stands in front of the horse and maneuvers it back into position. And I go, wow, okay, so here's where it's like, is this really truly beneficial for the client? What if that client was forced to tolerate being touched by Great Uncle Joe, right? Like, there's gonna be these things that are happening that are really subtle, but not so subtle when you know what you're looking for. And once again, it's like, is that horse really at liberty to leave, right? Or are they being coerced? Does that horse have a trauma history where it learned helplessness, and it learned that no matter what it does, it can't move away, and so it just stands there even if it's at liberty, right? So if we're not taking that into consideration, then we're potentially creating a reenactment that might be really unfortunate. I'm gonna skip this one, I'm gonna skip that one, and I'm gonna talk about this one. So one of the things my colleagues will talk about is something that I lovingly called magic unicorn syndrome, where we tout animal-assisted interventions, especially with horses, as being this sort of cure-all, right? I know a lot of the big names in animal-assisted therapy over the years have talked about how animal-based interventions are not a panacea, right? They're not intended to be this magic bullet that helps for absolutely everything. And unfortunately, in the horse world, we see a lot of that still happening in terms of, horses will co-regulate you, and if you come, the horse will read your nervous system, and it can tell that you're dysregulated, and it will come, and you'll feel calm, and the horses offer themselves as healers, and all this kind of language. And so if you have this kind of situation where the horses are made out to be these magic unicorns that have magical properties that come, and you have a client who shows up, and the client comes into the pasture or the paddock or whatever and has an emotional moment and was told and had the expectation that the horses will come and co-regulate, and the horses will come and be non-judgmental and support her in her pain, and she has a painful moment, and the horse is activated because of their own stuff, or they're uncomfortable with the emoting, and the horse walks away. What's the reenactment there, right? What are we doing that is setting up the people and the animals in these interactions for things that could easily be avoided, right? So magic unicorn syndrome is, I love horses, don't get me wrong, I think they can do some really cool stuff, and I think that there's also a place for wonder, and there's some things that we can't explain in terms of the resonance that happens. And there is also a place to watch for projection and interpretation and objectification of the animals in these processes as well. Because if we're objectifying the horse, we're placing on it an expectation that we get to use it for what it's offering, which is a lot of our trauma survivors, again, have experienced objectification of their bodies, right? So these things happen all the time in the field of animal-assisted interventions. So I'm going to wrap up by saying this. At the very minimum, we think about the concepts of non-maleficence and beneficence, I believe is how those are pronounced. Non-maleficence is do no harm, beneficence is at very minimum do good, or at best do good, right? And so this should apply to every animal and human and non-human animal in these interventions. Steve Porges will say the feeling of safety is the treatment, which means that we're looking to support consent, safety, choice, voice, empowerment, trust, collaboration, and compassion if we're going to have trauma-informed care for everyone involved. Thank you for your time.